So I'd like to begin with an opening reading by Judge Leonard Hand. What then is the spirit of liberty? I cannot define it. I can only tell you my own faith. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is a spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty reminds that not even a sparrow falls to the earth unheeded. The spirit of liberty is the spirit of him who near 2,000 years ago taught mankind that lesson he has never learned, but has never quite forgotten, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. So let us take a moment to meditate on these words, in particular on the pain that we're feeling and how our democracy is being challenged. This is the last of my trilogy of sermons on the Serenity Prayer created by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and explicated by his daughter, Elizabeth Sifton, in her book, The Serenity Prayer, Faith in Politics in Times of Peace and War. As those of you who witnessed my previous sermons, I first talked about acceptance in the Serenity Prayer, as in, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Or as Niebuhr had originally said it, God grant us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed. In my second sermon, I talked about courage, as in the prayer, the courage to change the things I can. Or again, in the Niebuhr earlier version, courage to change the things that should be changed. And finally, we come to today to speak of the idea of wisdom. As stated in the prayer, the wisdom to know the difference, and again, the earlier version, the wisdom to distinguish the one from the other. In her book, Sifton makes a point that there are significant differences between Niebuhr's prayer and the modern, more streamlined prayer that is used in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. Most significantly, she admonishes us not to think of change to mean to change whatever we want. Rather, we need to change that which should be changed to make us better people so that we live good and decent lives. In his original prayer, Niebuhr used the plural, us, the plural pronoun us, as he used it in his faith community, a small community church in Massachusetts, when he first gave the prayer. He did not do it as it later became by using the singular first person I. I personally, as an individual, want to do what I want to do to change. Rather, he spoke of what we as a community should do, suggesting that there are limits and admonitions for us to consider so that we can live a good and decent life, which melds into the idea of wisdom. For wisdom is not merely the idea of discernment, but of living that good and decent life. Wisdom is a topic one can expound upon, think about, discuss, not just in a sermon for 25 minutes or so, not just for days or weeks or years, nay, but for a whole lifetime. And even though it's an idea that's so important in the life of a person and of a people, it seems so very much absent from the American experience now, as can be seen most painfully this past week in the attempted insurrection of our democracy, not just by a violent mob, but by a president and his minions in Congress. Learned Hand was a judicial philosopher and a judge, having served in the United States District Court of the Southern District of New York, and later the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit. As of 2004, Hand had been quoted more often by legal scholars in the Supreme Court than any other lower court judge. I have learned that Learned Hand was a terribly insecure person, especially in his youth, which I find interesting and relatable. For we are all insecure, and it's important to be aware of our insecurities because that can lead us to wisdom. Learned Hand's voice of wisdom needs to be heard now more than ever. He speaks first of the spirit of liberty, which is not too sure that it is right. I will be speaking more about people's intolerance, which is expressed by their anger. And anger comes out of a self-righteousness, which is really a childish emotion, even though pretty much every one of us experiences it, say perhaps the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh. It's a childish emotion because it suggests that the world shouldn't be what it is. Now, truly, the world could be a better place in many ways, and having a determination, a mission, a passion for change is one thing, but unmitigated anger is another. That anger prevents people from thinking clearly and from listening to each other and working together in a community of sensitive souls, which we all are. That is the democratic way, and it's the best way to solve our problems. My last ministry was some 10 years ago in South Bend, Indiana. One time, several of my members and I went to hear a lecture by two authors at Notre Dame University. They were speaking on the religious attitudes of the American people. The first lecturer was Robert D. Putnam, Harvard professor of public policy and author of Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of the American Community, which posited the idea that we Americans are becoming less community conscious, and it's hurting us. The other was David E. Campbell, professor of political science at Notre Dame. Their book was called American Grace: How Religion Divides and Unites Us. It's a culmination of their exploration of the American religious attitudes, and they found that Americans are deeply religious, religiously diverse, and remarkably tolerant. These three attributes found together in America are unique in the world. The authors argued that if people are deeply religious, they tend to be not so tolerant. But one of their findings that I found interesting was the answer to the question, what religion do you most approve of other than your own? Now, it's no surprise that people found Islam to be the one religion they least approve of, and just above that was Mormonism. The religion that people most approve of, other than their own, was interestingly Judaism. During the lecture, Professor Putnam made a comment about Unitarians obviously neglecting the Universalists. And as many of you who know me, I consider myself more as a Universalist because I believe in universal values that's shared by all of humanity. The values of loving our partners, our children, our friends, the value of doing good work and making a difference in the world, the value of wanting to live in peace and harmony. The Unitarian part, which refers to the belief in one God, doesn't interest me as much. Anyway, Putnam said Unitarians believe just about anything they want. In other words, we Unitarian Universalists are free from dogmas, from theology, and even principles. After the lecture, I introduced myself to Professor Putnam to argue that we Unitarian Universalists do have beliefs that bind us together. He seemed surprised that I, as a minister of our religion, would suggest that we do have such beliefs. I said one of our cherished beliefs is tolerance of people's beliefs, religious or otherwise, as long as they do no harm. In other words, we're not a bunch of hedonistic profligates, but we are a serious people attempting to do good for others and ourselves. But I also was trying to argue with him that he and Professor Campbell was missing the point about tolerance, that they were too focused on the idea of religious tolerance and too sanguine about Americans being tolerant, rather than looking at all the belief systems that make Americans being intolerant and angry most of the time. I suggested that during the Vietnam War, many of my contemporaries on the left were intolerant and expressed their political opinions in violence. Now the intolerance can be seen on the right, from domestic terrorists to people bringing guns to political demonstrations. As I was trying to make my case, the person behind me was showing irritation and wanted me to move on so that she could talk to the good professor. Somewhat embarrassingly, that person was a member of my church. And so I moved on. Actually, she was right to ask me to move on, because I was talking about what it would take, what I was talking about would take much time to talk about. And indeed, it is what this sermon is about. Because I do look to the idea of tolerance more broadly, not of people of different religions, but people of different beliefs in general. And to demonstrate tolerance of others who have different beliefs is a sign of wisdom. Some years later, after retirement back in Kalamazoo, I became involved in doing interview shows for the Public Media Network and putting up my own show on YouTube and Facebook called Coffee, Politics, and Religion, CPR, Conversations to Help Heal America. During that time, in the summer of 2016, I was thinking of doing a field work piece and called, if you pardon the expression, since I'll use a wicked word, what pisses you off? Was to talk to people, what makes people angry, especially about our government. And remember, this was during the time when Obama was president. Because I was noticing among my fellow Americans, especially among Donald Trump supporters, that there was a lot of anger floating around, especially against our government. And I wondered why. It's not as if they were African Americans living during the time of slavery or Jim Crow, or even now. It's not as if they were Native Americans who were oppressed and massacred and their land stolen. It's not as if there were Jews during the Nazi Revolution in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. It's not as if they were poor or starving or homeless. These people were mostly middle class, white, and Christian. In other words, they belonged to the dominant class. At the time, the anti-Obama singer Ted Nugent was coming to town to do a concert. And I thought I would interview people standing in line asking, "Are you angry at our government? And if so, why?" But the concert never happened and my show never got off the ground. But I did record a few interesting interviews. And the most interesting was my first with our very own Ronnie Chung, our former piano player, to speak to the idea of how he views American and Burmese people and how they think about their countries and their governments. And so I will show you that video. Yeah, it's going. Okay, here's Ronnie Chung. And so Ronnie.
Harold, we can't see the video.
What's happening in the United States as a person who comes from. Okay, sorry. Try this again. Can you see it now?
We see it now.
Okay, here we go.
Yeah, it's going. Okay, here's Ronnie Chung. And so Ronnie, tell me your thoughts now about what's happening in the United States. As a person who comes from another country, maybe you have a good perspective that some of us don't have.
Right. So I think that most Americans are unsatisfied with whatever is going on in their lives, depending on what class you're in. And I think there's just a kind of like a bad attitude, really, about pretty much everything. It could be work time, it could be, you know, so. But the interesting is, comparing to other countries, Americans usually are doing better. They're probably earning more money per hour. And, so I think it's very interesting and kind of hard to sort of like see what the main issue, why everybody is not as happy.
It's hard to understand.
Yeah, it's hard to understand.
Yeah, so talk about how would you compare Americans to Burmese and
Right. So
from
like,
being from Myanmar and
well, being from Myanmar, like people doesn't really have anything. Like I think the average, like income, like you know, the average income per person is probably around like $1,000 per year.
wow.
So, and yet somehow they're doing fine. Like they're not miserable every single day that they wake up. So I don't know. It's
They're not as unhappy.
no, not at all. They're actually like, you know, they're actually walking around having fun and
Really? Yeah.
yeah. It's I felt, even I coming from there felt more pressured and I would say even dissatisfied, really, being here, which is really weird.
Yeah.
Because materialistically wise, everything is, you know, better here.
Yeah.
And yet something is kind of, yeah, I'm not as happy as I was.
Really? Yeah. So you're looking to go back to Myanmar at some point?
At some point, yes.
Yeah.
But that being said, though, the people from Myanmar, when you ask them would they like to come to the States, they would just say yes. Nobody would say no to that.
To visit or to live?
To live.
Oh, to live.
Yeah, because they're probably thinking, you know, we should. I don't know, like if you think about it, like, you know, water is great, 24/7 electricity.
Yeah.
All these things. If you think about it, it seems like a perfect place, really. And then they came here, and then they found out things are not necessarily. I mean, they are great. It's actually more than they expect, really. And yet somehow that's what a lot of Burmese communities in Battle Creek and Indianapolis are facing right now. It's they're kind of a little bit depressed, really.
Really?
Yeah. So
Because
I have no clue.
you have no clue.
Work, stress.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to fit in. I think it's difficult for them culturally. I don't know. They're not doing so well
Really?
in general. Yeah.
How are you doing?
I'm good. compared to them, I'm great.
Yeah.
I get to study at a university. I get to teach, and you know, I'm studying what I love doing. So
Yeah.
I personally am very thankful that I'm here. I think, for me personally, I think it's the expectation. Sometimes there's a lot of expectation for ourselves to be successful, whatever that means, and sometimes even if it seems like we're gonna fail, everything seems like everything seems gonna fall apart. Like that I am doomed to, you know, be a loser or something. Even if I didn't fail yet, like that little thought of like, oh wow, I'm not gonna be able to do that, or I'm not gonna be able to, you know, accomplish that. That puts a lot of fear in me personally. So when situations such as not being able to accomplish that arise out of it, we I become kind of paranoid.
Yeah, and stressed.
Yeah, and stressed.
So,
Exactly.
you know, like right now, we're having an interesting political season. In that there seems to be a lot of dissatisfaction with the government from both the left and the right.
Right.
And you come from a country that just recently had their first civilian-led
Right.
country in what, 25 years or so? Or?
Yeah, around there.
Yeah. So, can you talk about a little bit about that and
Right.
that people's anger towards the government maybe it doesn't make as much sense to you given what you lived with or what your country people lived with.
Right. I think it's just, again, it's this expectation that you have the right to do whatever you want to do. So I think, so like, okay, so for, like, to give you an example, like back home in Myanmar, when the electricity goes off, nobody gets angry. But one time there's this one little power outage at St. Olaf back in Minnesota that I was there, and everybody was really angry because they didn't turn in their homework and like blah blah blah. So it was a mess. And I was thinking, it's the event itself. It's the same thing. Like the electricity is off, and yet how we respond to it is very different. And I think Americans are so used to the fact that the government should serve us, and in a way it is. But I think there's a limit to it, and when the government couldn't do the things that they said they're gonna do, there's a lot of that. Oh, we should have this. We should, people are saying, why should we pay? It's just there's a lot of expectation, I think, from the government.
So, but are people in Myanmar happy with their government, or in the past were they happy with their government?
Oh, not at all. But
Yeah.
we don't expect anything from the government.
So you
That's
don't
the
get
difference.
you don't get angry.
No.
But here people expect things and they don't get it, and of course the anger comes out of expectation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like, from here, like, for example, like road construction, it's going to be summer. There'll be a lot of road constructions. People get annoyed from that, which I understand. But if you think about it, back home, if there's a pothole in the road, nobody cares about it.
Yeah.
And that's it. The pothole is just there. It causes accidents. It causes a lot of things. And then it's like, what can we do? And some nice guy might try to fill that pothole with some dirt or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's it.
Yeah.
But here we have constructions worker.
Well, maybe it's more a cultural thing, that the people in Asia are more accepting of things than.
I guess so.
Here,
Americans
seem to be impatient, right?
Yeah, here
Yeah,
you expect.
one of the things, and maybe you could comment on this. It's kind of interesting to me how angry people are, for example, say about when President Obama created the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
And you may not think it's a good idea, but people seem to be angry that it was created, and they said it violates the Constitution and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
That seems kind of interesting, the anger about that.
Right. I think Americans are a little bit, well, not all Americans, but what happened is I think money is involved here. So they're thinking, oh, we have to pay taxes, which goes to the government, and the government is using it to do all these things that we don't really agree with.
Yeah.
So I think, I think that's where it came from. That
They don't want to pay taxes.
Right. So I think if nobody pays taxes,
Yeah.
then there won't be any government. Then it will be a different story.
Yeah.
Because that's what happened back home in Myanmar. It's like nobody really paid taxes. We don't have a tax system like here. The government is So
how do things get done then? How do you?
I have no idea.
Yeah.
they don't get done. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, the water doesn't run.
Yeah, the water doesn't run. There's no electricity. There's no construction.
Yeah.
Fixing up the road. So that's how it is.
Yeah.
There's no healthcare really.
Wow. Jeez. Well, hey. Well, thanks a lot. This was great.
Yeah,
and,
thank you.
And good luck when you go back to Myanmar.
Oh yeah.
So Now, one of the things Ronnie and I did not talk about was the issue of the Rohingya people who are consistently being denied their human rights by the Myanmar government. And the government has refused to recognize them as Burmese, even though many of them have lived there for 3 generations. It's a sensitive issue for Ronnie, partly because he wants to go back to Myanmar. But it's important for us to consider Ronnie's wise words and the notion that we Americans expect a lot, especially from our government, and we don't want to pay for it through our taxes. But the problem is deeper than that, in that people fail to identify with each other, and thus we make our fellow Americans the other, and ultimately the enemy. We could be finding our democracy coming to an end if we're not careful. As a student of political science, I've come to believe that democracy is the best form of government. Or as Winston Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government, except when compared to all the others. But democracy is fragile and could disappear overnight, just as we've seen on January 6th. We need to take heed of Learned Hand's wise words here, of the spirit of liberty which seeks to understand the minds of men and women. I was talking with a friend who was a former member of my church in Troy, Michigan. He wanted to know what I thought about what was happening in our nation and why people would do this terrible criminal act of storming our nation's capital. He was born and bred in Lebanon, and so we got to talk about his experiences of Lebanon, especially before, during, and after their civil war that began in 1975. Despite Lebanon's size, small size, Lebanese culture is renowned throughout the world. Prior to the civil war, the country enjoyed a diversified economy that included tourism, agriculture, commerce, and banking. Its financial power and stability through the 1950s and 60s earned Lebanon the name of the Switzerland of the East, while its capital, Beirut, attracted so many tourists that has become known as the Paris of the Middle East. But what Lebanon has become since is a corrupt, autocratic, militaristic government, which no one trusts or respects. The key, my friends said, is the government spewing lies. And when that government spews lies, democracy dies. Our government, and in particular our president and his minions in Congress, have been spewing lies so that people begin to not trust the government, in this case, our election system, which used to be the envy of the world. If we cannot trust our election system, then our democracy is dead and violence will ensue. As John Kennedy said, those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. It is a shame that our leaders lack the wisdom to do what is right, to concede graciously when they lose an election, for example, because that would contribute to the strength and efficacy of our democracy. Thus, we witnessed the storming of our nation's capital, which, as Senator Chuck Schumer said, January 6, 2021 will be, as FDR said, a December 7, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. One woman among the conspirators who stormed the Capitol said this: "I made it like a foot inside and they pushed me out and they maced me," she said, almost wailing. "My name is Elizabeth. I'm from Knoxville, Tennessee," she later told the camera. Then, responding to the reporter's questions about why she wanted to go to the building, she yelled, "We're storming the Capitol. It's a revolution." A revolution in these United States of America. Is she talking about destroying our democratic elected government? It would be amusing if it weren't so ugly, violent, and stupid. Even though this woman thought she was fighting a revolution, she complains about being maced. If we were truly fighting a revolution, she would be lucky to still have her head. I have no doubt that if you ask this woman what she is complaining about our government, she would say something vague like, our freedoms are being taken away, or the election was fake. Ideas based on what she was told by the president and his minions in politics and the media. She was what Martin Luther King Jr. called, she has what Martin Luther King Jr. calls self-mindedness. As he said, quote, "This prevalent tendency towards self-mindedness is found in man's unbelievable gullibility," end quote. The threat of mob rule to democracy is only restrained by ensuring that the rule of law protects us from short-term demagoguery or moral panic. This January 6th mob reminds me of a lynching, and certainly racism played a mighty big role in its creation. In 1837, long before it became illegal, Abraham Lincoln wrote about lynching as, quote, "the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of the courts," end quote. We seem to have lost our way, if we have ever had it in the first place. That spirit of liberty that Learned Hand talks about, that there may be a kingdom where the least shall be heard and considered side by side with the greatest. Wisdom is called for here. I asked my daughter, Sarah, what she thought of when she heard the word wisdom, and she first said the word that came to mind was experience. And that does ring true, for we don't expect teenagers to be wise. And we do expect people as they grow older to become wiser. But of course, many teenagers can show wisdom, and many grown-ups, as we've seen in recent history, are fools. So she said the other part of wisdom is an openness to experience and to oneself, a recognition of our humanity that includes those dark places that can overcome the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln would put it. God knows we need wisdom, not just for our leaders and the elites, but for all of us. For we all have the privilege and responsibility of being citizens of our beloved country that has so much potential of moving closer to the dream of democracy based on equality and justice. For we can all be patriots. For with all its faults, we can love our nation because we love the land and we love the people. And also we love the ideals of our democratic principles. Let us hold to this ideal, and let us have the wisdom to know that we are all brothers and sisters, for we are indeed Americans.